If you were in the audience last month, we talked about the whole idea of brain science and the cyborg, what that means, somewhere between science fiction, science fact, precariously balancing between art and science. Well, let's start from that as a concept tonight. Let's begin a discussion tonight with the idea that neuroscience and neurotechnology are, in fact, game changers. They don't only have the potential to change the human condition, the human predicament of pain and suffering, but in many ways, perhaps, the human being and human society. That said, my argument is going to be quite simple. This really instantiates the need for this field called neuroethics. But if we look at neuroscience and neurotechnology, one of the things that we see is that these two fields have existed, in many ways, the way much of science and technology have existed throughout human history, in a reciprocal heuristic. What we do is we utilize the tools of science, in some ways, to develop new theories. In this case, theories about the brain and what the brain does, which is to, in some way, give rise to this thing that we call consciousness in the mind. As we develop this theory of mind and brain, we then develop even more sophisticated tools. In some cases, not only simple techniques, but actually technologies. Technologies that we can use to assess the brain, access the brain, and perhaps control, manipulate, and target the brain, and in that way, affect our cognitions, our emotions, and our behaviors. But despite such progress that neuroscience has created over the past 50 years, and in fact, I must tell you that for those of you who are not neuroscientists, the discipline as we know it today, neuroscience, which is a fairly common term in our lexicon, has really only been in titular existence for about 30-odd years. To date myself somewhat, when I first went to school, when I went to graduate school, there were only 4 programs in neural science. Now, you can't wave a wet rope over your head without hitting neuroscience programs in universities, colleges, medical schools, even high schools. And so what we've really seen is this groundswell of activity. Studies that address their focus upon the mechanisms and substrates of the brain. But I'm going to give you an adage that's common in neuroscience. Organisms have a brain, but it seems that they are a mind. And the deeper we dig into this fertile ground of brain science to try to understand the substrates and mechanisms of this thing that make us tick cognitively, emotionally, and behaviorally, the more we confront the perdurable questions that are not only philosophical, but that are social, moral, ethical, and perhaps legal, upon which much of contemporary society rests and is undergirded. These are what the philosopher David Chalmers has referred to as the hard questions or hard problems of neuroscience. And in many ways, this represents the almost ineffable characteristics that we have when we look at each other. We ask these questions, and as a result, what we've developed is a neurally based, a neurocentric philosophy, what neuroscientist and philosopher Pat Churchland refers to as Neuro Philosophy. And indeed, as we learned last time here at DASER, it may very well be that we're moving into a neuroculture, where what we learn about the brain and mind defines very strongly what we do and what we are. But still, these hard questions remain. What is consciousness? What is the mind? Is there a self? Is there free will? And each one of these particular questions and the potential answers that they may generate or not generate or be ungenerable based upon the tools and technologies that we have really stir up, foster ethical, legal, and social questions, issues, problems, and of course compel and may sustain our search for its potential resolutions. It's this sort of perpetual hard question of neuroscience that really gave rise, gave birth, sustains, and nurtures this relatively new field called neuroethics. The term neuroethics was first used by the philosopher and scientist Adina Roskies, and she coined 2 traditions, if you will, 2 foci, 2 approaches that neuroethics could in fact assume. The term neuroethics really caught fire, if you will, when used by the late New York Times columnist William Safire at a Dana conference. The first tradition of neuroethics really speaks to the neurological mechanisms or basis of ethics. It's a misnomer, if you will. These are really studies, approaches, attempts to try to define the neurological basis of what may be our moral decisions and actions. In many ways, that too is difficult because our group, working both at the Center for Neurotechnology Studies in Georgetown, as well as the group that I play with in Ludwig Maximilians University in Germany, really recognize that it may not be morality that we're looking at, but rather how do we as humans, and maybe even other species, interact with each other in those ways that we may have some disposition for, and how do we then recognize goodness, badness, rightness, wrongness? How do we define it? How do we act upon it? Our group refers to this as neuroecology, if you will, but what that really does is that situates the fact that brains are embodied in organisms that are embedded and nested within their environments. And this is a bidirectional level of interaction. We must view neuroethics and neuroscience in this regard as looking at brains as systems nested and functional and embedded within systems. You can't take one out of the other. The idea that we may be able to determine a neurological basis of what may be proto-moral activity doesn't dispel necessarily our capability for free will. It only changes the focus of responsibility. Evermore, what it does is it puts that onus of obligation to prove that the techniques and tools that we're using to demonstrate, illustrate, and define what is moral, what is not, what may be ethical, what is not, and what may constitute legal or not, are in fact not only good, but technically right. This then brings us headlong into the second tradition of neuroethics, which are the ethical issues that arise in and from neuroscientific and neurotechnological research and its various applications, certainly in healthcare and medicine, and I think these are probably apparent. What are the boundaries upon utilizing brain science and its techniques to treat, to cure, to prevent? But also, the use of neuroscience and neurotechnology in our daily lives. Increasingly, what we find is that neuroscience is becoming part of our lives. The idea of utilizing, for example, computational technology, the idea of utilizing image processing, the idea of the fact that we're looking increasingly to the way our brains process information, integrate information, and communicate that information as a basis from everything from our media to our economics to our interpersonal interactions, and perhaps even the way our interglobal relations exist for things like national, international security, intelligence, and defense. All of these are in some way influenced by, affected by, and perhaps will be articulated through neuroscience and its technologies. Of course, each and all of these may generate profound issues that interface with what we consider to be moral or not, ethical or not, legal or not, and which nest squarely in the social realm. From that, I'll provide for you neuroethical premise number one, which is quite simple. What do we do with this information and capability we have to assess, access, and target the brain, and in so doing, affect, control, and manipulate consciousness, cognition, emotion, behavior? It asks that question, how will we use this information and this capability that we have at our fingertips? And, moreover, what will we do about that information and capability that we lack? Inclusive of the question, will we recognize the fact that we lack it? Or will we beat our breast with some false hubris and commit what we've referred to as Icarus folly, false pride? Oh, we know enough to go boldly where no one has gone before and intervene, when in fact we then get the intersection of unknowns. We may not know what we think we know about the brain, and we may not know what we think we know about the technology, and it works. And as a consequence, we commit this sort of double folly, not recognizing the limits and limitations of our own capability. And then we must ask, how do we guide this? How do we direct it? How do we govern this? Well, let's take a look at some of these issues, because they are many, they are profound, and they're growing. I would argue that you can't go to a magazine store, open a newspaper, or even take a look at the news or some television show without seeing pictures that look just like this. They're pretty, aren't they? Some of this has been done by our group, who does a fair amount of neuroimaging. These are, in fact, neuroimages. They are scans of the living brain, It utilized a variety of techniques, inclusive of things like radioisotope tracing, blood flow, magnetic spin of particular molecules, and bouncing magnetic molecules off of water molecules that exist in various tracts to provide these wonderful pictures of various types of activities and effects that occur in the brain. And we're very fond of pointing to these pictures and saying, this is your brain on drugs. This is your brain in love. This is your brain thinking about your wife or bourbon or maybe both. We're also very fond of also perhaps weighing these images and saying, this is the brain of someone who has this disorder, who is normal or abnormal, who may be guilty or innocent. And increasingly, we're looking to this type of technology as perhaps a basis to harness other techniques and technologies to scan brains, but in so doing, compare these to large enough databases and computational models to literally read minds. Science fiction, but 10 years ago, I would argue, perhaps. Oh, we're not there yet. Whoa, 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 wait a minute. Efforts are certainly being made to move in this direction through large-scale data banks and increasingly complex multifold techniques that allow us to harness image like this to be able to target certain brain sites and then use other forms of neurotechniques and technologies to be able to literally intuit what may be going on a network level, compare that to large-scale data banks and databases, and as such create a reference standard that may actually allow us to interpret what these brain images mean in terms of what the individual may be experiencing and perhaps, although still distant, thinking. Then you get to this, the idea of utilizing information that we first generated from the Human Genome Project to then focus upon the issue of the genome of nerve, of brain. How then is the human species expressed with regard to its genes for the potentiality of what our brains are and could become? How are those genes expressed in a particular individual? How do those particular genes then code for particular proteins, what we call phenotypes and proteomics? And can we use these as potential markers that will in fact determine a disposition for somebody to have a particular disease, disorder, develop their brain in a particular way, have dispositions and trends towards the way they might engage certain thoughts, emotions, behaviors? All of this is being debated. All of this is certainly on the palette of contemporary possibility and has even been posed in the peer-reviewed literature as ways that we may be able to use genomic, genetic, and proteomic science. The idea here is that can we predict present and future activities of thought, emotion, and behavior? Can we predict our present selves? And it's not just assess and access, but can we then target those substrates and mechanisms to change them? Today, tomorrow, and in so doing, might we be able to create whole new trajectories of what we might be and what we might become? I put up before you the film Gattaca. Indeed, science fiction, but the premise is one that looms large on the horizon of potential and possibility. Might we not utilize this type of neuroscience and neurotechnologies to affect these ends? Not only do we assess, obviously what we assess are also targets for our intervention. So you have the interventional neurotechnologies, the things such as, for example, new drugs, neuropsychopharmacologics that are able to change the way we think, the way we emote, the way we react, our level of motivation, our level of pathos, perhaps our level of empathy, our level of excitement, vigilance, arousal, fear, sleep. All of these are certainly on our contemporary palette of pharmacology. The question now is making these ever more sophisticated and specific. And indeed, there is a very strong trend to do this because of their very profound medical effect to reduce the human predicament of suffering, pain, sadness, disorder, and illness. We use a variety of these drugs, not only alone, but increasingly with other devices. Indwelling devices, such as brain implants, that have been utilized to mitigate the effects of devastating disorders, such as Parkinson's disease, increasingly being looked at as a viable treatment for certain types of chronic pain, anxiety disorders, intractable depression, perhaps even certain forms of dementia. But we must recognize also that we don't fully understand the way many of these brain networks and mechanisms work. And we've seen, for example, certain side effects that were unanticipated. Not only was the target disorder affected, but in some cases, persona, emotions, preferences, behaviors. Might we then also utilize these techniques and technologies to target those effects, those outcomes, and those variables? A form of designer neurotechnology and neuroscience, if you will. Indeed, it's not beyond the pale of what we're doing with contemporary medicine. We need only to take a look at certain forms of cosmetic and concierge surgeries that are available to affect those areas of our physiognomy that we view as problematic or difficult. Should we stop here? Can we stop here? And we don't necessarily have to put something in the head. Increasingly, we're trying to develop those technologies that can be done externally, such as the use of transcranial magnetic stimulation that provides a weak magnetic current field to the outside of the head, which then changes the way superficial networks of cortical neurons respond, and in so doing, affect underlying levels of neurons and networks to change cognitions, emotions, sensations, behaviors. These two are being used on a much broader palette than they were originally envisaged for. And again, we're not stopping there. The idea of developing tissue transplants, genetic grafts, and these tissue transplants are not solely from human tissue, but increasingly we're looking to synthetic and biosynthetic means to develop neurons in culture, or develop neurons in other species that are then what we call chimerografts, grafting other species that are compatible with neuronal fields in the human to then replace lost brain body parts. The question then becomes, can we use these techniques to target identifiable brain mechanisms and networks, even if only partly understood, to mitigate or abolish pain, sadness, and suffering, and perhaps expand our cognitive, emotional, or even moral capability? Then we move even deeper into our technological realm, and we look at things such as brain-machine interfacing. The idea of linking humans to a variety of different machines, from the very, very simple, what my wife likes to refer to as my extended lobe of my handheld phone, that is also a computer resource at my fingertips that allows me unlimited memory, as long as I can figure out how to work it and Siri doesn't talk back to me, to things that are far more sophisticated. Implants, explants, uplinks to computers, downlinks to computers. This is not science fiction either. There are many human computational interfaces and brain-machine interface laboratories, both here in the United States as well as in other countries, namely Japan, Germany, the UK, and of course in China, that are deeply studying the ability to up and downlink human neural function to computational systems to be able to expand cognitive capability. More and more, these will not just be large, bulky devices, but actually contain devices. The true cyborg, the level 3, level 4 cyborg, where these are embodied, contained. These are not extricable devices, and may in fact actually be those devices that may even reproduce at least part of their function within us. This is the idea that Nick Bostrom and his group has bantered around as a potential transhuman. Our group refers to this as the human in transition, and it's quite real. One of the conversations I was having before this lecture, a gentleman in the back said, do you think that perhaps in 500 or 1,000 years we will recognize what the human of the future will be, given the integration of biotechnology within this human soma, this human body, this human self? And of course, we're also using this technology the other way, to model machine circuitry, biosynthetic circuitry, to reverse engineer neural networks and brains. The question then becomes, are we prepared to go over that threshold of the machine that is conscious, cognitive, experiences pain, and sentient? This too has been a boundary that we've come abutting precariously close to in recent years, and in some cases have prudently stepped back because we may not necessarily have the ethical horsepower to be able to deal with those questions. Because the question really is, on both sides of this coin, what will we make? And of course, the answer may be, are we really ready for a new governor of California? Or not? Then there's this other area, which my colleague, the philosopher John Moreno at Penn, likes to refer to as the dark side. And it's not necessarily the dark side. It is, in fact, utilizing neuroscience and neurotechnology as science and technology have been used since time immemorial to be able to preserve particular values, integrities, and populations that one community holds dear so as to defend against others who may threaten it. The use of neuroscience and technology in security, intelligence, and defense agendas. This is quite real, and it is not new. My colleague Rachel Wertzman is sitting in the back of the room. She and I had developed a treatise on neuroweapons as part of a larger document that was part of our journal Synesis at the Potomac Institute Press, out of the Potomac Institute, that looked at neuroscience and neurotechnology in national security, intelligence, and defense agenda. This has been around for a number of years, but is certainly gaining steam and momentum and recognized as a very realizable potential. In fact, the Office in Science and Technology Policy has recognized that neuroscience and its technologies will play a game-changing role in a number of different fields inclusive of international relations, global security, and national defense. The idea here is, what will we do with this? And of course, this does not exist in a social vacuum. Indeed, these goods, these resources and services of neuroscience and neurotechnology exist deeply embedded within the social sphere. And so we have to ask serious questions about what it is we're doing. Where does the boundary between treatment, enablement, and enhancement lie? Who should be treated? Who should be enabled to do more, to do better? Who should be enhanced to go beyond perhaps what was previously considered to be viable human limits? Are there limits? What will we lose when we expand what appears to be the existential gain of enhanced or embellished cognition, emotion, behavior, and capability? What happens when we change the human predicament? What would happen if we eradicated pain and suffering? And are we ready for what that would look like? And of course, all of these exists as frontier science, where we may think we know what's there, but there may be things that are unknowable and perhaps unknown. Moreover, these things also exist at that interface between the socio-legal sphere, and this is where we encounter what we like to refer to as NELSI, neuroethical, legal, and social issues. Increasingly, neuroscience and its technologies are being used in courts of law to determine things like capability, culpability, guilt, viability. Are simple legal standards that are currently used, such as the Fry and Daubert standards, sufficient? Or will we need to, in fact, develop more stringent standards, capabilities, as has been bantered around by our group at the Potomac Institute and colleagues with our friends over in Germany at the University of Bonn? And if, in fact, we say, yes, we will use these particular things, and we will use them to achieve particular goods, then we must ask, as the philosopher Alistair McIntyre has, how do we define the good? By whose cultural standards? Is there the possibility for some global guidance on neuroscience and neuroethics? If we're going to use these in patients, how will we inform these patients when, in fact, we know we're sitting right on the edge of what we know and what we don't, how much information is sufficient? And how will we then utilize this science and technology to create new norms of what will be the new normal, the new abnormal, the new right, the new wrong, the new good? As you can tell by these past few minutes, and hopefully my provocation here has been one that has allowed you to see that each one of these potential issues exists within this coin of the face of Janus. Oh yeah, look, we can utilize neuroscience and neurotechnology to strive for tremendously utopian aspirations of equality, of relativity, of relationality, of eradicating disease and mitigating illness, of making better the human condition and decreasing the human predicament. But at the same time, the exact same issues, questions, potentials, turn the coin over and then raise the possibility of dystopian anxieties. How then will we deal with this? This is the neuroethical premise number 2, and it's the one that I will leave you with. It is, in fact, that given what we can do, what should we do? And what should not be done? How do we guide the way forward? What we're working with ardently, and which you'll hear from my colleague, Mike Swetnam, will be that it's not simply enough to sit around under a tree and look at the lint on our navel and think great thoughts. Oh, it's wonderful philosophical exercise, but indeed this pendulum swing is moving quickly. The momentum of science and technology in general is rapid, and the momentum and groundswell of neuroscience and neurotechnology is perhaps the most rapid of all. I argue that we must mind our Q's and P's. These questions of neuroethics require pragmatic analyses of what can really be done and what cannot be done. What are the capabilities and real limitations, not being augmentative or extrapolative, but being real about what we can do, both in terms of our science and tech and what we can do in terms of handling it in our various societies. We have to be prepared for the fact that this will happen. And if we choose not to do it, it doesn't mean that someone else won't. Are we prepared for this groundswell of global activity so as to not be caught with our knickers down around our knees? It's going to take multidisciplinary personnel, not only scientists, engineers, medical types, but philosophers, ethicists, lawyers, artists, storytellers, narratives in a public as well, to be conjoined in this discourse that becomes ever more dialectic. I've argued that we need to be a bit pessimistic through a sense of skepticism. Things could go wrong. Are we ready? How can we mitigate those things that go wrong, and not simply by adopting a mere precautionary process or stance any longer? It won't work. The momentum and pace of neuroscience and technology won't allow us to simply say, let's stop. Because moreover, if we just stop, very likely that someone else won't. Neuroscience is also an economic game changer on the world stage, and there's much power to be yielded by what it can do both positively and negatively. So the way we move forward is through some prudence in action and decision and policy, but it's the policy that puts the rubber to the road. And as you'll hear later from my colleague, Mr. Swetnam, it's making that policy and translating it to something viable and usable that really is the hard part. And in many ways, it's these initial thoughts, it's this particular set of instantiations that really defines the work of neuroethics to help us guide neuroscience and neurotechnology. You know, my dad was an engineer, and he and I used to build things when I was a little kid. It's something I actually like to do very much still, fix things up, build things anew. When I was a little kid, my eagerness to put things together and build them and maybe even take them apart and reconstruct them, I used to rush into a project and tackle it wildly with vigor and zeal. My father, ever the engineer, used to bounce me on his knee and he used to say, "Jim, measure twice, cut once." My dad was a really bright guy. I miss him very much. He would have made a great neuroscientist and a hell of a neuroethicist. His maxim, I think, holds true. The question is, how shall we measure? What shall we cut? For all too often, there's no turning back. Thank you for your time.